Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Module 6 lecture on helpful recommendations. Um, I think I've mentioned in previous lectures my great fondness for Quality Matters, and when one is a Quality Matters peer reviewer, you look at an online or hybrid course and you apply the rubric to the course and give feedback to the faculty member about whether they're meeting the Quality Matters standards or not. And when you give feedback, they have a format for giving that feedback as a helpful recommendation. So given that we're talking about giving feedback this week, I thought it would be helpful for me to tell you about the Quality Matters helpful recommendations. And you can learn more about this by taking the Quality Matters, applying the Quality Matters rubric course. So let's see. When you're going to be giving feedback in a lot of different ways as teaching professionals. You'll be giving feedback to students, of course, on their homework. You'll be giving feedback to peers if you are, peer teaching, or if you have the opportunity to observe a peer, you'd be giving feedback. You'll also be giving feedback to senior teachers. Excuse me, again, in an observation setting, or as we'll be talking about more at the end of the quarter, maybe you'll see your senior faculty doing things in a way that you've learned differently at school, and you want to introduce to faculty a new way to do something, and that's a form of feedback suggesting that they change to do something different than what they're doing. So that's one form of feedback. You'll also be giving feedback to administrators. Sometimes they'll be directly asking you for feedback, sometimes not, and you just need to give it to them anyways. So all sorts of ways that as a teaching professional you'll give feedback. And in the helpful recommendation is a way that you can give that feedback, and it has 5 specific components. It's constructive, specific, measurable, sensitive, and balanced. And we're going to talk about each of these in turn. And I'm actually, as I was writing this, I thought, you know what, I wrote an email earlier today that had many of the elements of a helpful recommendation, but some were missing. And so we're going to actually look at the actual text of that email and talk about how it met or didn't meet the elements of a helpful recommendation. So the first portion of the helpful recommendation is that the feedback should be constructive. And when you're offering constructive feedback, you want to try to offer solutions, not just identify problems. And in the example that I'm going to show you from the email that I wrote earlier today, a colleague in a different office was asking for some feedback on an email that he was about to send out to all the faculty in the Seattle Colleges district. And it's a topic that we'd been talking about as administrators, and it was time to bring faculty to the table so that they knew this big project that was going to be going on. And so he was asking, was this a good communication out to the faculty? So I didn't think so. I thought that it needed some help. And so I wanted to give him some constructive feedback. In being constructive and offering solutions, not just identifying problems, I noted that I appreciated the careful detail that he had paid. Oh, I should go back and say that the document that he presented was very long, about 3 pages, and it was in a sort of bulleted format with sort of an FAQ format. Here's a question, here's an answer, here's a question, here's an answer, and the answers were really long and really vague. But or really sort of neutrally worded, and in trying to neutrally word them, they ended up being really long and really vague. And so I noted that I appreciated his careful attention to detail, but I didn't think any faculty were going to read it because it's too long. It was really long. And some suggestions that I had, here's the constructive piece, have 1 or 2 short sentences at the top summarizing why faculty should care about this and how it directly impacts them in their work. So I have identified a problem. This is way too long. Nobody's going to read it. And my solution is to have a couple of sentences at the top explaining why faculty would want to read the whole long rest of the email. So the next element of a helpful recommendation is to be specific. And in being specific, you want to not, when you're offering that solution, you want to give a specific example of what's being recommended. So in my example, here's another portion from that email. And here I noted that it was, like I said, sort of very neutrally worded, and as such was sort of hard to figure out what he was actually saying. And I noted that it might be interpreted by faculty as being administrative gobbledygook, but I had a recommendation. So here are two paragraphs. One is his original paragraph explaining what it was, and then the second is my revision of the paragraph. Here's specifically how he might change it. He doesn't need to change it like this. This is just an example. And so here I am being specific in my feedback. The feedback should be measurable so that the person receiving the feedback knows when it's been implemented. What if you, in the QM helpful recommendations, if something hasn't met standard, we offer the opportunity to change it so that change the course so that it can meet standard. And so the faculty member would need to know when someone goes back and looks at my course again, what are they going to be looking for to see that it's better? And so that's the measurable piece. If somebody did something, how would you know that they had taken you up on your suggestion? What would that look like? And saying that piece is the measurable piece. So here, I'm going back to that beginning of it, to that same message about it being too long, and a measurable example I gave was move some of the pictures. There were some great pictures at the bottom of the message, at the bottom of a 3-page message. I just didn't think anybody was going to get to those pictures, but they were very helpful, showing examples of what he was talking about. So I suggested moving one of the pictures to the top so that people had a visual to work with. And so if I was going back to see, did he implement my suggestions, just seeing a picture at the top, I would instantly know that he'd implemented one of the suggestions. Now, being sensitive, you want to avoid negative language, and you want to keep recommendations and comments on a positive note. Because, when people ask for your feedback, they're sort of putting themselves out there. Like Brookfield said, there's a lot of emotions that come with getting feedback, and you guys may be experiencing that this week, that even when something is very optimistically said or very positively said, when somebody says, even in a positive way, this is really bad, it's hard not to take that personally, hard not to feel a little bit wounded by that. And so if they don't say it sensitively, that makes it even harder to not feel wounded by what somebody said. So keeping that in mind when you're giving feedback, you want to give feedback in a positive way. So going back to the text of my email, perhaps it was not very sensitive for me to have said administrative gobbledygook. There might have been, and there probably were, many ways I could have said this more sensitively. And in fact, why don't I give you an opportunity to give me some feedback on how I might have said this in a more sensitive manner. So thank you for your feedback on my feedback. The next element of a helpful recommendation is that recommendation be balanced. You should point out the strengths as well as the weaknesses of the work. My husband has always talked about the idea of a compliment sandwich, where you say something nice and then you give the critical piece and then you wrap up with something nice. And so that's one way of thinking of a balanced recommendation. And in my email, I had noted that I appreciated their careful attention to detail, but the negative part, I didn't think anybody was going to read it because it was too long. So that's, I'm pointing out the good thing. It's very carefully worded, but so carefully worded that maybe it's a little too long. So that's another element, being balanced. So Those are the elements of a helpful recommendation. And as you can imagine, making sure that a piece has all of those elements, particularly when you're seeking out examples and in the specific portion, you can imagine this takes time. Yeah, it does. Helpful recommendations take a long time. If you think of those, the lengthy feedback that Brookfield shows you as an example in the feedback for students, you know, writing something like that takes time, and it's easy to think that you can't give that kind of feedback on every single assignment and still maintain a life as a faculty member. So it's important to sort of think about which assignments are you going to give that have that level of detail, or where are you going to engage that deeply, so that your helpful recommendation really is helpful. And a portion of it is just thinking, where is this going to make the most difference? Or maybe when you're giving feedback, you could give one piece of detailed feedback, and other pieces of it, even on the same assignment, not in so much depth. So um, I recognize that helpful recommendations take time, and I think it's important that you recognize that and sort of schedule that in when you are being asked for your feedback, so that you have a sufficient amount of time to think through and write down or speak, or however you're giving the feedback that is detailed enough to be useful and helpful to the people who are receiving it.